August 1832, Augusta County, Virginia. The air is thick as bread, holding its rise even after dark. In the vestry room behind a clapboard church just outside Staunton, a parish clerk, shirt stuck to his back, hands stained with iron gall, slips a folio from a drawer and reads an entry he has written twice and believes only once. Intimate reversed by family request. Coffin reopened. Subject breathed, speech attested. He does not scratch it out. He does not underline. He folds the page and ties the tape as if binding an animal that might yet stir. The summer of '32 did not give Virginia kindness. Cholera, a blue, devil disease that stole color and breath, ran down the canals and turnpikes from New York and Philadelphia, and took rooms where families had not invited it. Richmond shut its theater and opened its windows. Rural parishes posted notices. No wakes past nightfall, no crowds in closed rooms, enter within the day if the Lord allows. Doctors argued miasma versus providence. Undertakers measured quietly. In a world that kept the dead at home and sent them to the ground under wool and scripture, the century's worst fear woke like a child in a bad dream. What if the stillness is not death? What if we bury breath? In a small house on a rise above a mill run, a young woman lay on a pine bed under a sheet her mother had hemmed in better weather. Her name appears in 3 different hands in 3 different places, as if paper could not agree on a person. Letitia Hale in the vestry minutes, L.H. in a doctor's daybook, Tish in a letter a cousin folded and never sent. 24. A miller's wife, the kind of woman you do not notice until she is absent. She had a habit, her sister wrote once, of falling still the way a field falls still when wind leaves it. Cataleptic, some would later say, a word that had not yet found a home in the county's mouth. On a Tuesday, Letitia collapsed beside the wash tub. She did not cry out. She did not clutch at the air. Her hands, soap slick, slid to her sides and stayed. By the time the doctor, Taliaferro, or Talifer, depending on whether you trust the ledger or the way neighbors said it, arrived with a mirror and a feather and a phial of laudanum, her skin was cool and her lips the color of lac. He held the mirror to her mouth and saw nothing. He pushed the feather against her nostrils and felt nothing. He listened, which is to say he put his ear to a place he had no right to be, and heard only the argument of his own blood against certainty. Cholera collapse, he said at last, as if a name were a verdict. God receives what he sent. The rules of that summer were not kind. Enter quickly. Do not assemble. Do not tempt the disease by honoring it. The miller, a practical man whose hands could read a plank for straightness without looking, went to the carpenter. The carpenter, a man whose joints were his pride, planed a lid. The women washed Letitia the way their mothers had taught them. Cool cloth, careful places, the small respect of a comb through hair, and pinned her shroud while her sister watched and did not weep, because there are tears that feel like blasphemy. They set the coffin on trestles in the parlor and drew the curtains half, closed and placed a plate of bread by the door. Old ways persisted, even under notices nailed to church doors, you sit with your dead. Neighbors came in twos. They did not touch. Someone draped the parlor mirror because habit does not ask the sheriff for permission. Someone pressed a palm to Letitia's forehead and pulled it back without admitting to warmth. The clock in the hall sounded too loud. In the next room a child laughed, and her mother's hand reached without thinking, like a bell rope, and stilled the sound. The next morning, the pallbearers came. The minister, young enough to be earnest, old enough to have learned the twist in men's mouths, when they chew grief like tough meat, read familiar words with a new caution. They lifted the coffin, shoulders learning weight, and carried it into heat that felt like intention. The churchyard on the low rise had not yet learned to fear its own soil. The hole yawned the way holes do, workmanlike, not aware of metaphors. They set the coffin on boards above the open ground. The minister spoke. The miller stared not at the hole, but at the lid that made a line he could not step over. A woman sobbed the kind of sob that sounds like an apology. The breeze turned once like an animal finding a place to lie. Not loud, not theatrical, a rattle, a complaint. The kind of sound a carpenter hears when a joint is not as it should be. the kind of sound a mother hears when a baby wakes. The men did not move at first because moving would have meant believing. The minister kept speaking because stopping would have misused all his training. Then the knock came again, 3 breaths later, closer to the center of things. A voice, someone said afterward. A breath, someone else insisted. A word one person swears to even now, on paper that has outlived everyone in the yard that day. Cold. There is a way men who work with iron behave. When something fails, they do not argue, they reach. The blacksmith, who had come to do nothing more than be a shoulder, reached for the screws and turned, fast, the way he would have turned them if the coffin were a stove that needed opening before a house burned. Another man seized the other corner. The miller's hands moved without asking the rest of him whether it was wise. The lid came up on a hinge meant to be final. Letitia opened her eyes. How long the silence lasted depends on whose story you read. In one account, penned later by a county historian who thought adjectives should be rationed, it was minutes, perhaps an hour. In a letter never sent, her sister writes, "Time went out of the room and stood on the stoop." The doctor, in his daybook that never meant to be read by strangers, puts it simplest: she breathed. He adds, perhaps in an attempt to make that word smaller, brandy, friction, warmed bricks. They did not bury her. They lifted the coffin as if it were a cradle, not a door, and carried it back to the house that had not yet forgotten how to accept her. The minister did not finish the psalm. The pallbearers wiped their hands on their trousers and did not look at one another. The child in the next room laughed, this time like a bell ringing because bells ring. The clerk's note, interment reversed, is the line that scholars cite because it can be cited. More paper exists than you would expect in a story like this. The vestry minutes that record, alarm at interment, coffin reopened, subject spoke. The doctor's daybook with the 2 words that are the closest thing to a shout he ever wrote. She breathed. A second entry 2 days later that turns the shout into a whisper. Abated, and a final, ungenerous word a week on in the same hand, the ink a little more tired, deceased. But another story persists, and it is the one that sets teeth on edge. Letitia attended her own funeral and spoke from the coffin. Which is to say, she heard her name in the words the minister used to deliver names to God, and she disagreed. But why did this happen? And why was it erased from history? Before we continue, if this story intrigues you, subscribe and ring the bell, so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical mysteries. And tell us what city or state you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of history enthusiasts. To understand how a woman could attend her own funeral in 1832 Virginia, you have to walk 2 roads at once, the narrow one that runs through her house and the wide one that runs through the century. Letitia, born Hale, married to a man named Merriweather or Merriweather, depending on the spelling in the probate indices, lived in a place that was learning to be modern and clinging to its old pieties. Augusta County was crossroads and frontier, both German farmers and Scots, Irish elders, enslaved men hired to build mills they did not own, a courthouse that wrote everything down, and a dozen kitchens that trusted the air more than the judge. The house where she kept her bed had a parlor with a carpet that thought well of itself and a back room where the floor told the truth. Family remembered, spells, not fainting in the gentle, flattered way diaries sometimes mean it, but absences, a falling still that passed like weather and left her as if nothing had happened. A midwife's notebook, penciled in the margins of a recipe book, then pressed into a trunk under quilts, mentions Miss L with the stills again, no foaming, no struggling, color leaves then returns. Catalepsy, a physician might have said in Richmond, in a farmhouse, it was Lord help us, and a cool cloth. Then the century arrived with a new fear. Cholera came up the James and along the Kanawha and dropped into towns as if hunting. Local notices urged bury within the day. Richmond printed handbills advising against wakes in closed rooms. In Vienna and Paris, men had begun building waiting mortuaries, Li Chen a user, where the dead were watched by attendants for days. Bell strings tied to fingers in case life was only shallow. Rural Virginia had no such buildings. It had parlors. It had neighbors. It had quickness that felt like mercy and could be something else entirely. Medical men were not of one mind. Some argued miasma, bad air that slunk low and wore fog like clothes. Others spoke of humors and will. A few read foreign journals and took notes in the margins about apparent death and suspended animation, phenomena that seemed monstrous until you saw them and then felt monstrous for having doubted. It did not help that hospitals in Richmond and Charlottesville bought bodies for teaching, as if the dead were freight. The fear of being taken before you were gone enough, as the century would learn to say taphophobia, was a hum that settled in a skull and never left. By 1831, newspapers in Virginia had printed accounts, reprinted from English journals, mostly, of people restored at the bier, of coffins reopened on a knock, of men who awoke as the sexton reached for a ring. Poe, who would write the premature burial a decade later, lived in Richmond then and collected stories the way a man collects excuses. Folkways adapted. Some families kept vigil for 3 days regardless of cholera. Others tied strings to fingers, as if that could bully doubt into submission. Undertakers, sensing a market, ordered Bell pulls from Cincinnati as if iron could ease conscience. Letitia's house bent both ways. Her husband could recite deaths like weather reports and still polish the mantel. Her sister saved hair from the hairbrush to twist into mourning wreaths, because that was what women did when they needed a task grief would allow. The parish kept 2 books, one for the proper story, one for exceptions no one wanted to argue about loudly. The second book would grow a note that sounds brisk and reads like a prayer. Intimate reversed. Tuesday, August 7th. If you trust the doctor's daybook more than the memory of men who found their lives more interesting a decade later. Heat lay on the creek like glass. Linen dried too fast and then not at all. Letitia worked in a way that would not have been called work if you asked her husband. Men name things differently when they do not do them. She rolled a sheet against a board, rung lifted. The world went away. Her sister found her in a pause that did not look like sleep or grief, but like absence. She called twice, Tish, and touched once, as if violating a rule. Nothing. She sent for the doctor, and the boy ran with the easy speed of boys who think running improves outcomes. The doctor brought the tools of knowing, a hand mirror because breath leaves signatures, a feather because noses are honest when mouths are lying, a tincture because doctors must be seen to try. A half-dozen women stood at the door because habit is not superstitious, it is practical. The more eyes, the more safety. The mirror did not cloud. The feather did not move. The tincture did nothing. The doctor listened again, as if he could hear a solution in the shape of a rib. Cholera collapse, he said. He may have been right. He may have been guessing at a word large enough for his fear. He may have been compressing uncertainty into a diagnosis, because the county liked the sound of decisions. What followed is every family's ritual and exception together. The carpenter planed, and the bedroom opened the way rooms open for both birth and death, with a small clearing made in furniture and talk. The women washed. The men stood and looked at the floor, because floors allow men to think they are aiding the left, behind by not meeting their eyes. The minister approached and was told, out of respect for notices and warnings, that the service should be brief. Nothing about that day was brief. Letitia's child, 2, perhaps, or 3, asked once, "Mama sleeping?" and was answered, "Hush." The mirror was draped because you do not let souls get caught. Windows opened because you do not tempt a disease to linger. A plate was set by the door because you do not leave your dead alone. There is a difference between superstition and respect. It looks like bread on a plate you will throw to chickens when no one is watching. Night fell the way it does in hot country, fast. Candles guttered. The man who made the coffin tested the screws with the habit of a hand that does not trust even its own craft. The doctor left and promised to return, as if doctors had jurisdiction in a room that will not obey them. The child slept at last, head tucked into breath that smelled of milk. The sister sat, and somewhere in the dark a whip, poor, Will said the 2 syllables it knows. It did not say, "Wait." Morning arrived as if it had always planned to, without apology. The men came because men like to bear weight when nothing else can be borne. The minister walked in the particular way ministers do, balancing reverence and rehearsal. They lifted the coffin and felt what oak feels like on a day of heat. The procession to the churchyard had fewer steps than felt proper. Cholera teaches short routes. Under the sycamore that had seen a decade of both weddings and burying, they set the coffin on boards, the whole yawning like a labor that never asked to be scheduled. The minister began, "I am the resurrection and the life." The words had corners. They knew how to be recited from memory, even when memory did not wish to serve. The knock, if knock is not too precise a word for the insult of sound against an argument, came from under those words like a disagreement. It shivered the lid. It made a sound the blacksmith later described as mistake trying to be corrected. Wind. Someone in back said later that he said, "Settling?" The carpenter said, "Because wood does settle and men prefer natural explanations that implicate their craft rather than their creed." The miller said nothing, because he had heard his wife tap a table to call him in from the yard 100 evenings. And here was that shape, that exact measure of insistence, in a place where nothing ought to insist. Then a voice. We are trained to distrust that sentence in stories like this, because voices are what you get when memory tries to help and ends up performing. But multiple memories in unconnected documents agree on something at least like it. Cold. Wait. Don't. The doctor wrote only, she spoke, which is what men write when they are trying to keep parts of themselves intact. They opened the coffin. There are accounts that place the blacksmith at the head and the miller at the foot, and the carpenter swearing an oath. He later repented in church. Screws moved like decisions reversed. Air moved like a debt paid late. Letitia's chest rose and fell once, a movement so small that it would have been missed if 20 people had not been watching for any reason to keep standing upright. Her mouth shaped sound as if words were pushing their way back into a space that had been evicted. Cold, someone insisted for years after, as if the word proved something beyond temperature. They carried her back because the earth had not earned her that day. They set the coffin on the table, where dough had been kneaded and fever broken, and babies quieted. They rubbed her arms the way you rub a child's when winter finds them through a sweater. They put bricks on the stove, and then under her blanket, and if you want to know a century's science, you could do worse than that picture. Heat applied where understanding fails. The doctor held brandy to her lips and prayed in a language he never repeated in front of anyone else. She opened her eyes and looked not at the men who had undone the lid, not at the minister who had not finished, not at the child who was making the sound of questions before he learned them. She looked at the ceiling, as if ceilings had answers. The sister cried the way women cry when they are alone. She did it out loud and in public, and no one told her to hush. Later, when what happened next had settled into its shape, the sister would write, "She was among us again, and I had no more language." There are two endings to this story, and they disagree with a vigor that speaks to how much we want stories like this to behave, and how little they do. In one, Letitia lives. The brandy stings awake something stubborn. The heat finds a place to sit and decides to stay. The doctor, out of both caution and pride, returns every day for a week and writes in his book, Improvement, her heart, no one wrote heart, because that feels like a confession, behaves. She asks, 3 days later, what did he say? The minister blinks, because men who say the same words at many graves do not often have the opportunity to hear them quoted back. The pallbearers come by that evening with their hats in their hands and sit awkwardly in the yard and laugh more than civility requires. The child climbs into her lap and puts his ear to her chest as if listening will teach him what the doctor did not teach him. According to this telling, Letitia bore another child in 1834 and died in 1843 of a fever that kept its promises. Her stone, small, curated by weather, leans in a churchyard that trouble now avoids. In the other ending, Letitia returns for an hour. She attends, which is to say she is there while her sister uses both hands to turn fear back into task's bath water. A calm, bread held to a mouth, a hymn hummed because hymns are the only thing that works when the world won't. She says 3 words no one writes down the same way twice. She closes her eyes again while the minister is still trying to decide if he has ever been given this kind of day by God. And she is gone the way she had not been before. The doctor's book, in this telling, carries the cold arithmetic of his bravery: breathed, abated, deceased. The paper we can touch is partial and punctual. The vestry minutes say, interment reversed. They do not say, return to the ground 2 days later, or live to be seen at market buying spool cotton and arguing about price. The doctor writes, deceased. A week after he writes, breathed. The county's mortality schedule for 1832. A new way the government had invented to pretend the nation could understand itself by counting. Lists a woman in her 20s. Cause: cholera, sudden. A letter in a family trunk that sold at an estate auction in the early 1900s reads, she was between, and we did not know where to place her. That is, perhaps, the most accurate account any of us ever get. Who investigated? No committee, no court. A parish that feared scandal less than disease and more than error. A doctor who had enough humility to write a single verb, and not an essay. A county clerk who did what clerks do. He took a noise and made it into a line that could be indexed. A story like this does not attract commissions, it burdens kitchens. But later, decades later, historians, physicians, and men who make a living out of other people's astonishments carried their own lights down into the room and offered their interpretations. Theory 1: cataleptic suspended animation. The medical language caught up to what country women had been naming for a long time. People sometimes enter states of profound muscular rigidity and reduced responsiveness that can fool a mirror, a feather, and a man eager to go home. Catalepsy, narcolepsy, hypothermic coma, cholera, collapse. Each points to a ritual danger made plain by science. The fear of premature burial that suffused the 19th century did not arise from nothing. It arose from cases like this, from men with mirrors writing, no breath observed, and being wrong. Evidence Letitia's, spells, noted in a midwife's margin, the doctor's cautious shift from cholera to breathed to deceased. The speed of burial dictated by cholera panic, cutting short the old 3-day vigil that would have served as a waiting mortuary. European journals as early as the 1820s catalogued apparent death, with recommendations: warmth, friction, watch for 2 nights. Rural Virginia had friction and warmth. It did not have time. Theory 2: post-mortem artifact, collective mishering. Wood settles, screws resign. In heat like that week's heat, pitch and tallow can talk. A coffin lid can groan in a way that resembles intention, because grief trains ears to interpret hope. The voice some heard might have been a hinge protesting, being made to hold the last weight. The breath the doctor recorded could have been the escaping air people sometimes insist is the soul, and he insists is chemistry. The speech attested in the vestry book is the courtesy of a clerk, unwilling to call neighbors liars. Evidence: not everyone at the graveside that day later insisted on words. Some, in the WPA oral histories collected a century after, say only a racket. Memory is a craftsman who likes a flourish. Contested accounts are a county's way of living with the fact that reality does not owe us certainty. Also, the doctor wrote, deceased, within a week. If the revival had been robust, would he have closed his book so quickly? Theory 3: the sexton story. A theft interrupted. Lurid, but it insists on being heard. Resurrectionists supplied bodies to medical men. Rural churchyards fed city lecture halls. A sexton with a heavy hand and a habit went to his day's work and found himself interrupted mid-task by a breath he mistook for his own. He panicked and fled the scene with a story that covered his intention. The coffin knocked because men knocked into it. The voice was a man who had almost been caught. The family reopened the lid to find bruises they later called miracles. Evidence: Richmond papers in the decade before and after this case printed accounts of body snatching. UVA's medical school had skeletons its professors did not account for publicly, But this theory requires that a man approach a coffin at a crowded graveside and work with tools that offer their own commentary. Saw lever, without attracting attention. That strains credulity unless you are committed to believing the worst. Theory 4. The waiting mortuary dream forced on a farmhouse. The parish had read enough about apparent death to be afraid and not enough to be methodical. The no wakes notice collided with the we must watch instinct. The result was a compromise that lived for one night and died in a phrase. Interment reversed. The chamber with bells and attendants that Vienna built to solve a city's anxiety was not available on a ridge above a Virginia mill, so the parlor tried, and the yard hijacked it. Evidence, the vestry set, within a month a new, unwritten policy noted only in a steward's book, where disease does not forbid. Wait the night. The hardware store ordered a dozen small bells that fall. The undertaker's invoice, preserved in a box that no one thought would interest anyone. Lists, cord, bell rope, 12 lengths. Changing practice is how communities confess. Perhaps the strangest theory is the one that feels least like a theory, and most like a profession's wish, that this is folklore, grafted onto a woman whose death was ordinary to justify the town buying bells and its storytellers buying adjectives. The lady, who spoke from the coffin, is an international legend. In England, the thief who cuts a finger and frees a woman. In France, a bride revived by cold air. In America, a widow in New York who sat up and asked for tea. The tellers move these women around like chess pieces, because the lesson is useful: do not hurry. The difference here is the clerk's entry, the doctor's verb. The records called it reversed. The locals whispered something else entirely. The morning after Letitia breathed, the house smelled of brandy and starch and fear. The week after, the hardware store near the courthouse put a small display in its front window that had not been there before: a handbell on a block of mahogany, a length of clean cord, and a card printed at some expense. For the vigil. A farmer who had laughed at bells in town now watched his wife tie a string to their neighbor's finger and felt something unclench in him. He still argued against superstition. He quietly went back to town and bought a second bell. By the winter of 1833, the parish had settled into a compromise with its own conscience. Notices no longer barked inter within the day, as if speed were piety. The vestry minutes, never as frank as rumor would have liked, show a line that looks bureaucratic and is in fact an act of humility. Where circumstances allow, the family may request a night watch. The undertaker wrote, "Watcher," on 3 bills that spring, charging for a man to keep a candle and a mind open until morning. In a county where men who called themselves practical were beginning to call themselves modern, that was radical. Beyond Augusta County, the century built out its fear like an industry. Franz Wester's burial case with a bell and a tube was patented in America in the 1860s, decades after German and French cities had built halls where the dead were given 3 days in the company of cats, who, legend had it, would not lie with a corpsey, and men paid to keep their eyes open. Safety coffins with air pipes, lids that opened from the inside, flags that could be raised from within. Some worked, many did not. The point was not always efficacy. Sometimes the point was solace. Poe in Richmond, a boy during the cholera years, made a career out of turning fear into furniture you could sit in. The Premature Burial, published in 1844, reads like a ledger of rumors given rhythm. He insists on true accounts, then confesses to invention, then insists again. He is the clerk and the sister both, needing to write, interment reversed, and write, I woke, and make both sound like prayer. Whether he heard Letitia's name in a parlor or not is a kind of trivia. What matters is that his story lands as plausible in a place where a parish clerk once tied a tape around a page he did not know the rule for. The lives immediately around the Halig Meriwether house changed in ways no census can capture. The child who put his ear to his mother's chest that day grew into a man who became insufferable in later life, about counting the nails in a coffin lid and insisting on seeing them turned. The sister kept 2 mirrors, one for her hair and one to hold to mouths at need. The minister learned that sometimes the correct theology is to stop talking. The doctor learned to write smaller. The blacksmith, who had turned screws, started lifting lids an extra inch when he made hinges, not because he expected anyone to need to open from within, but because memory teaches hands to adjust. The community learned to name the difference between policy and conscience. Policies, no wakes, quick interment, were born of fear dressed as sanitation. Conscience, leave the lid one night longer, sit with your dead, listen, refused to be bullied by notice. Men who had farmed, argued, voted, and attended to their own business now, attended to other people's breathing in a way that would have made their grandfathers scold, and their grandsons nod. The story refused to stay in one house. In neighboring counties, a cousin wrote to a cousin. They nearly took her and she spoke. In Lexington, a schoolteacher wrote in her little blue book, "Do not hurry me." In Staunton, a bell on a piece of string caught dust in a drawer and then suddenly became indispensable. That is how culture works. When it behaves itself, a shock becomes a habit, and then the habit becomes a way of seeing. Not every telling was kind. In the 1890s, a county historian with a taste for scolding wrote that women in that era were prone to nerves, an assertion that mistakes courage for performance and fear for femininity. A Works Progress Administration interviewer sat on a porch with a woman whose grandmother had sat with the Hale girl and wrote down. She said a word, and the government file kept the word without refusing or endorsing it. In the 1970s, a folklorist at the University of Virginia, trawling for motifs, tagged the case, "Lady Who Spoke from the Coffin, Type E265, a taxonomic cruelty that has its uses. Labeling is a profession's way of convincing itself it is not participating in the story." Perhaps the truest legacy is this: the fear of premature burial stopped being something we mock and became something we bridge with craft and courtesy. We tie strings, we watch, we wait. We insist on hearing. We put our hands on lids before the first spade falls. You could call those behaviors superstitions, but they feel like civilization to me. And then there is the older, harder legacy, the one that lives anywhere records are partial and families are tired that the line between death and the appearance of death is not as wide as pride would like, and that the only responsible thing, then and now, is to leave room for breath. Perhaps the truth still lies hidden in a family Bible with the year 1832 written carefully and nothing after, in a doctor's day book where a page was rubbed thin by a thumb, in a vestry drawer where a clerk wrote, reversed, and never saw a second line, restored. We step away from the churchyard now, from the sycamore that has probably been struck twice by lightning and refused to admit it, from a house where a table learned both ends of a ritual, and from a page with a single line that has not stopped trembling. A woman listened to her own funeral. A coffin knocked. A breath came back into a room that had already begun speaking in past tense. A clerk tied a ribbon around a fact. A town bought bells. Which theory makes the most sense to you? Was this catalepsy? Suspended animation mistaken for death by a mirror and a man in a hurry? Was it the house wood and weather having their say, and grief doing what grief does when it wants relief, turning noises into words? Was a resurrectionist frightened off, and a town given a story that helped it build better rules? Or was this precisely what it looks like in the clerk's hand? Interment reversed. Because sometimes faithfulness to the living requires disobedience to a schedule. What detail caught at you? The knock at the graveside, the clerk's unassuming spoke, the brandy on a mouth that had been stone, the child leaning into his mother's chest to hear what the doctor could not be sure of. Tell us in the comments. We read them all. If this episode pulled you in, give it a like and ring the bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical mysteries. Stories where the archive preserves one slender sentence and rumor supplies the rest, and where, if you listen carefully, history speaks from places we thought were sealed. And in our next episode, we'll pry open another sealed moment, a New Orleans charity hospital ward in 1904, where the Thursday night ledger shows transfers to annex, but the annex appears on no blueprint. When a storm dropped the cistern wall in 1915, a porcelain patient tag washed up with a number no ward clerk would admit to assigning. Was it a bookkeeping error, or a corridor no one was ever meant to walk?